Okay, so the place that I want to start is just a brief word about the concept of inviting children to worship. Some of you, I recognize a lot of you on the screen today, some of you are coming as parents and some of you are coming as disability ministry leaders who I hope will then maybe pass this along to your families if you find this helpful or think that they can benefit from it, or just you give them tips that they need at a pace that they need. But some of you are coming to the table today because you have had children that have been being cared for during the whole of the worship hour. And so here you are trying to enfold them in an hour without nursery support or children's church support, or maybe some sort of disability ministry support that cared for your child during that hour-long time. So the question that some parents are asking, and especially, I mean, again, putting on my mom with disabilities hat, we're tired and we're working on a lot of skills all week long. We're doing 24/7 caregiving. Therapies are not in place. We're running the ends of work and school. And so a lot of your families may be tired. And while they may not raise their hand and say, hey, I'm not sure if this is even worth it, they may be pondering that on Sunday morning. It's just easier if I keep my child occupied somewhere else while the rest of us engage in worship, because after all, they're not even involved in worship on Sunday morning. So if that is your starting place, or if you're just considering the question of how do I move forward when we go back to church after having been home all this time, maybe now's the time to train. And so all those questions start here. Do we invite them to worship? Number one, I want to say it is not easy, whether you are in a church building or whether you're at home on live stream, whether you have autistically developing children or whether you have children with disabilities. Enfolding children into worship is work. And I think right now, 4, almost 5 weeks into being home, sometimes we just need to remind our hearts that it's work. And it might be, and we will go into this a little bit later, some of our own expectations that are revealed in our frustrations on Sunday morning when it doesn't work well, because we just want a chance to relax or rest or find rest in Christ and hear the sermon ourselves. It is work to get our kids enfolded. And I would say even more so children with disabilities, which is our vantage point today, our little slice of the pie. Number 2, we are all created to worship. So don't forget that. Our kids with disabilities, teens, adults, in us, we are all created to worship. We all know that our hearts will worship something. If it's not worshiping God, it will be something else. And so reminding ourselves up front that we are created to give him glory. And we as the parents are here to bring our kids along in that so that they give him glory too in the ways that he has fashioned them in his image. And number 3, I like to remind myself each week I am an evangelist for better or worse. I include my kids, and likely you include your kids, in the things that you love. If you love sports, it's very likely that your kids will have the same affections or similar affections for sports. It's likely you'll be out there throwing the ball with them, or kicking the soccer ball, or teaching them the rules of the game while the sports are playing. If you love to garden, you'll, like me, I've had mine out in the dirt. And they're boys, they love the dirt, so gardens are great. And along the way, you're trying to impart a little bit of a love for what we're growing. And look, here's a little surprise that God brought up out of the ground. A little bit of interweaving what I love with the things of the Lord. But a lot of times I forget, unless I'm intentional, that involves, this process of being an evangelist also involves my love for the Lord. And on Sunday mornings, worship is, for years has been such a delight for me on Sundays, until I had children and it became work, and delight and work met. And then I realized, wow, this is a whole different ballgame. In order to transfer that delight to them, I have to work really hard sometimes to remind myself, this is what we were created for, and this is what I want to impart to them, peace and joy and not frustration. I don't want them to remember Sunday mornings as the time that I bite their heads off. I instead want them to gain mom's love for worship, even if they're not getting maybe all that I want them to learn this week. Second, children participating in worship. I wanted to read just 2 verses. I've given you a couple of examples here in the middle, but 2 verses that, one from the Old Testament, one from the New. There's so many passages in the Bible that show children with their families in worship. So just to remind your hearts, this is not something that we are crafting. This is something that is there. So in Joel 2, verses 15 to 16, blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the people, consecrate the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children, even nursing infants. Let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber. So that picture of, this is Joel calling his people, the congregation, to repentance and looking forward to the coming of Christ. And so here he's gathering everybody, not just the adults, but he's calling all of them to come and repent and worship God. There's several examples here that I put from the early books in the Old Testament. Passover, where children are involved, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Booths. You can check those out. But it's not just an Old Testament design for worship. It carries forward into the New for our covenant family. So Acts 2, 38 and 39, repent and let each of you be baptized in the name of the Lord Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, for the promise is for you and your children, you and your offspring. So that covenant blessing extending to and call to the whole family. I like to think about what are the main things as I'm training my kids with disabilities, intentionally trying to train them in the things of the Lord. What is it that matters? And someone a long time ago planted the image of what we really want our kids to do is to grab hold of the gospel, just like a runner takes hold of the baton and keeps going. And his illustration was that relay races are often won or lost in the transfer of the baton. It's not usually that a runner drops it while holding it. It's usually when one hands it to another that transition or transfer causes the baton to fall. And so when we think about parent to child, there's that baton that we're passing on to another generation, and we're wanting them to take hold of the gospel in the ways that they can. And my heart and passion is that our kids with disabilities can do this just as our typical kids can. It just, the fruits of it might look a little different. The way that they interact, engage, respond to, answer questions about, all of that is going to be nuanced through the lens of brokenness. But God is at work in their hearts, and it's still our calling to pass off that baton so that, Lord willing, one day we'll say we have no greater joy than to hear that our children are walking in the truth. So diving into Livestream, the disadvantages, let's start there. So the first disadvantage is we lose some formality. I have enjoyed watching pictures of people worshiping all across the world via social media. I'm sure you all have too. And some are on their sofas, some are at their tables, some are in chairs, some are on the floor. I'm sure across the world, some are in pajamas and some are dressed up. It really is dependent on the family, the coming to worship posture. I don't think in this context, I think the disadvantage of losing formality is that it can feel like the rest of the morning kind of creeps into worship and then keeps going. It's not distinctly set apart. We don't get in our car and go to church and see a new set of people and sit in pews and do a different thing. We're at home doing the same thing. So how do we make it different? Number 2, it's more challenging to remember that it's corporate worship. Livestream helps, and you can tell your children that we're doing this at the same time as all the other believers in our church, but they can't see them. And I think it's important to remember with kids with disabilities, they're very literal, a lot of them. Mine on week 1, not anticipating the preparation that was really needed to tell them that we were not going to do church at church, we were going to do church at home, through big protests. This is not church. This is not how we do church. I mean, just very adamant. We don't do church on the computer. We do church at church, what has mom done? Like all these years of laying the same rhythm that we do on Sunday mornings, all of a sudden I'm surprised we're not going. We're going to sit right here and do it. And they were not fans at all. It took us 2 weeks or so after that before just the transition into and the expectations for we're doing this alone at our house really started to sink in and we could make some progress. Number 3, there are more distractions. You all know that home is filled with things. It's harder for me to pay attention because I'm often thinking about what needs to be done or what just happened. Whereas when you're at church, you are set apart from the busyness of life. And at least for that amount of time, you're only engaging in the walls around you, which don't remind you of chores or items on the floor that need to be picked up. Number 4, home might be paired with certain behaviors that don't appear as frequently in public. So that's another disadvantage. You may see things popping out in your children at home that they would never do at church. Simply because home is more comfortable and familiar. And that should be the way that it is. We want our kids to love home and be more relaxed there, but that can be a disadvantage. So the advantages of worship via the computer would be that our children can move around without distracting other families. I think this is a huge positive for kids with disabilities. Often we really worry as parents about making noise, disrupting others, being too loud, too much, for people to handle. And in this context, that's really okay. Now, we might not want our kids screaming off the rooftops during worship on the computer, but my point is there's more room for noise and movement, and it can be okay in this context. Our children can talk, make noise without distracting others. We can also press pause. We're going to talk about that a little bit later when a break is needed and then resume. One thing that may feel awkward to you is thinking about stopping a live stream. We want to keep worship going. We can't stop it in person. But I'm going to also argue that in the training of our kids, it is sometimes more helpful to press pause ahead of problem behavior than it is to let it keep going and pair certain parts of the worship service with those problem behaviors that then repeat week after week. Number 4, we can talk and instruct our kids much more easily. I feel a lot more comfortable. I talk to my kids throughout worship, even in the sanctuary, whisper, to keep them engaged, to help them know what's going on, not just negative, trying to correct behavior, but positively trying to engage them in what is happening. But I often am aware of who's sitting around me, but it's a lot easier to do that when you're at home. And then I want to go into just a few minutes on the parents, dive into the kids. So great expectations. I think one of the challenges in folding our kids into worship is likely parental expectation. If you find yourself frustrated at home, you'll see at the bottom of the screen what makes me frustrated. If you find yourself frustrated, the answer to why you're frustrated will reveal your expectations. You may not think you have expectations on Sunday morning, but almost all of us do. And so my question would be, what expectations do you have for worship, for yourself, or your child with a disability, or your other children? If you can write those down, name them, write them down, and start praying about those expectations and how those expectations may limit us reaching or attaining successful next steps. It could be a game changer in setting more realistic goals that your kids and your family can do and be successful in. And then there's gospel reality. So my life feels like great expectations here, and then gospel realities, what I want us to do, and then kind of where we come in. And the gap is where I get sanctified. Where we come in is often the starting point, skill level, ability level of the family as a whole. My great expectations are often what create that revealing of sin on my part, where I'm trying to push or prod along or get frustrated or angry with when things don't go the way that I want them to go. So the gospel realities, the most important thing you can do to begin successfully pulling your children with disabilities into worship is this. If you walk away with nothing else, walk away with this. You have to set realistic, gospel-centered, which means grace-based goals. Gospel-centered in this context of goals does not mean that what we set, we try to perfectly attain. That's what Christ did for us. That's why we celebrated Easter and the resurrection. We set goals and God gives grace, and he meets us in the messy process of taking steps to reach those goals. If you have been around with us in this ministry very long or have attended any of our online trainings before, you'll know that one of the things I say over and over again is small steps. I just believe in baby steps and small steps, both with kids, teens, and adults with disabilities and in ministry, and for myself. Sustainable long-term habits are so much easier built one little pebble at a time instead of me trying to push the boulder and then wondering why it won't move. Grace-based is giving grace to yourself and your kids. God gives it to us, and it's not about perfection. But how do we set those goals? The first thing you need to consider is, what skills do your children have, or does your child with a disability have? I think a lot of times we forget all the skills that are needed for worship, and so I've listed those out here. The first one is probably where we default to the most. We think about attention to task, quiet mouth, listening ears, still body, engaged in worship. So if you had that, likely you wouldn't be joining us for today's training. Some variation of that is probably challenging for your kids. But breaking it down even further, receptive language skills. That means that I need to be able to fully engage. I need to understand what I'm hearing. Transition skills, being able to move from one part of the service to the next, whether that's praying to speaking, or singing to standing, or singing to speaking. Call and response versus singing, is even the nuances of that. And I'm also thinking about the transitions where at church, this was one that threw my kids. At church, we would stand to sing, and then at home during our family devotions, we usually sit to sing. And so they had paired singing with sitting here. As silly as that might sound, it was a big hurdle for us the first week to think about, are we going to stand? Are we going to sit? And when we suggested standing for worship, that transition just fell apart. So you're going to learn as you go what transitions are going to throw your kids versus which ones are not. But transition skills are very necessary to get to the place where they're engaged all the way through. Some of that you're going to have to decide, what do you want your kids actively engaged in and participating in? Expressive language skills, to be able to sing the hymns, to be able to do the call and response, to be able to say he is risen indeed on Sunday morning, involves the ability to use words, the ability to follow that sequence. They say, I say. Reading skills, having to follow along in the bulletin, read scripture, read the words on a screen, read the hymns in a hymnal. Behavior skills, self-control, quiet body, ability to occupy oneself when bored. We're going to talk about that a little bit more too. So all of these are needed in order for your kids to do what you might do without even thinking about it, which is sit there, sing, pray, worship, read your Bible, listen to the sermon, and then the sermon ends. So here's where problem behavior occurs. When our expectations and goals are large, and our child's skills, our preparation, and our peace and joy are small, we often find problem behavior. It's not just that our kids don't value worship, or that they have never done it, or that they haven't learned. A lot of them really don't have the skills needed to be able to do the things that we really want them to do. And we haven't taken the opportunity to break those skills down and teach it to them in a way that we can build that process back up so we can make it all the way through worship. Notice here I also put our preparation and then our peace and joy. If we have kids with appropriate skills, those can still be capsized when we're rushing into worship at the very last 3 minutes before it comes on. If our peace and joy isn't in the right place, our hearts aren't in the right place on Sunday morning. And we all know that Satan loves to get us in the wrong place on Sunday morning by throwing in all the things that the kids could possibly do wrong, or all the fights and the fusses that could possibly happen before we're supposed to sit down and joyfully worship together. So when our expectations and goals are big and our kids' skills are small, we often see problem behavior. There's a couple of approaches to problem behavior. I'm using the word problem behavior instead of bad behavior in this context, because problem behavior presents as an alternative for kids with disabilities, an alternative to appropriate behavior, because they often don't have the skills. When my boys lack skills, they revert to doing things that they can do instead of what I want them to do, not because they're being intentionally bad, but because they don't have the skills to do the right things. It still looks like maybe intentional sinning at times, but you have to keep asking yourself, are there skill deficits, or is this is it a heart issue? If skills are there and we know there's mastery and there's just, I don't want to, that falls into a different category than what we're talking about here for problem behavior. So problem behavior that presents with lack of skills, there's a couple of options. Number one is you can plan to ignore it. If you have an only child, if it's just mom and dad and one little person, or there's enough of an age gap in the siblings that you can tell the siblings to not pay any attention when problem behavior happens, you may be able to extinguish some of the problem behavior you see simply by ignoring it. You may be able to. This is really challenging to accomplish if other kids are present. They like to laugh and they like to be distracted, and they're looking for any opportunity to not be engaged in worship too. But if it's just mom and dad, you may be able to ignore, not give any attention to the problem behavior or some parts of it, and it will go away if you stick to ignoring. Kids repeat behaviors because it works for them or they get attention. So if they don't get what they want and you don't give them attention, and you can do that long enough, some of the behaviors will go away. Number two option, which I'm sure almost everybody has tried along the way, would be to negatively reinforce the problem behavior. So this works well if skills are present and you are consistent. If you know your child can do a certain task and they just don't want to do it, and you're consistent in the consequence that follows, eventually they will do the task. If they don't possess the skills and a negative consequence follows, that becomes a very onerous activity to engage in. You're telling them to do something that they can't do, and then something bad happens on the other side of it, and it can get very conflicting to especially little kids and younger elementary kids with disabilities. If you've tried being consistent with consequences, which again, biblical model, we all do. We want to reach the heart. We all try to be consistent. And you find that problem behavior gets worse or it doesn't change. That's when you know you're in a different category. It's how I always encourage families. If you're being consistent and you're doing the things that you've done with your typically developing kids and behavior gets worse, then we're probably in a different category. So that's where option 3 comes in, and that's where we're gonna keep coming back to through the rest of this training, and that is positively reinforcing proper behavior. So a lot of our kids, especially literal thinkers, when you tell them to stop doing something, that does not tell them what they should be doing. So stop hitting your brother, okay? That might get them to pause for a moment, but it doesn't teach a replacement skill. What should they have been doing? And it also doesn't work equally to catch the good behavior and positively reinforce that. Parents in general are much more apt to respond to problem behavior than they are to good behavior. So another tidbit that you can take away from this, if any other things, it is you want to make sure you're giving your positive quality attention to good behavior when it happens. You don't want your kids working for your negative behavior. Lots of our kids want us, want more of us, want more of our attention, our time, our love, our affections. And kids with disabilities don't care if it's positive attention or negative attention. So we want them working for our positive attention, and that often means a mindset change for parents. We have to catch the good and specifically tell them and label that as the appropriate behavior we're wanting to see happen. Great job handing that to your brother. I love how you're sitting on the couch with quiet legs and you're not kicking the coffee table. I love how you put that hymnal down so carefully instead of throwing it like you did last time. I love how you are not using your hands to push or bother your brothers and sisters while we're doing worship. Catching them and specifically telling them that is good, that is what I'm looking for, and your face and your expressions show will go a long way towards positively enforcing what we're trying to build here. Positive reinforcement, you can also think of this as attaching value to what your child does not value. Reinforcing things, it should be a matter of getting access to things they love when they do good things. And this is my quick, easy analogy here. All of us that have a job, we work for a paycheck in the adult world. We work to earn money to bring home to do the things that we need to do. So similarly, work for us may be hard or taxing, it's long hours, it's work. The things that we're trying to build in our kids here, the skills, it's work for them. Don't forget that little piece. Kids with disabilities that don't quickly pick up small skills along the way have to be taught, and it's hard work for them to demonstrate them. So we want to come in and reinforce with things that they love in order to show them you work hard, you get good things. So a little bit of a word about reinforcers, because we're going to talk about this throughout. Reinforcers need to be things that your kid loves. This really is dependent on how well you know your children. If your children have access to all the things they love all the time, you might not find those reinforcers to be very helpful. With our boys, we have set aside things that they work for during the week for school, and on Sunday it's a different set of things that they can work for. But I don't give access to those things on a regular basis for play. They're the special stuff that we earn for working hard on the tasks that are challenging. They have to be in a subset of what your kid loves, again, in order for this to be effective. And the reinforcers do not work if they're not immediately delivered after you meet your goals. So if your child is working hard and they are not getting access to something that they wanted to work for, when they have shown that proper behavior, you're probably going to have problem behavior re-entered. I put a list in the heart of a couple of things that we used to use in the worship context that was easy to do and it went a long way and kind of builds on interests. Parents have to get creative on these. One example was I had special train stickers, and I would cut a strip of them. I cut them actually into enough strips that one child could earn them every 5 minutes during the worship services. We were acclimating and getting longer and longer. This was in the real sanctuary, not at home. And he had a certain thing that he had to do during those 5 minutes to earn those stickers, and he would use the stickers on the church bulletin and make trains that went all the way around them, and delighted in them. One child will do anything for a dum-dum. He's my easiest. You just have to have a sucker and we are good to go. Another one loves volcanoes, and we would draw volcanoes, and during the sermon, for example, if he went 5 minutes with quiet hands, quiet feet, quiet mouth, we would hand him the volcano for a minute, and we'd give him a minute to color interrupt it, and then he'd hand it back, and he would go back to work again, listening to what our pastor was saying and trying to truck along. At one point, we allowed access to move. For us, that was allowing one child who did not do well in pews to sit on the floor for 1 to 2 minutes. He would earn that break. Another one earned holding a favorite toy for 1 or 2 minutes. These are things that and I'll tell you how to get it going in a minute, but these are things we worked on before we got to church so that they could be easily given and easily taken back. And the kids thought it was such a fun game, and it helped us to make those problem behaviors not reappear. The bigger picture, I do want you to think about a couple of things before we do the nitty gritty. Number one, problem behavior often results because of a buildup of demands. So demands are things you're asking your children to do. Or it's a deficit of skills, like we've talked about already, the ability to do all the things you're asking. So here's the question. what are you doing or requiring your kids to do before worship begins? Before worship, for my encouragement to you would be, before worship is not the time to ask your children to do demands that are challenging. You are going to require them to work during that hour and learn skills and do things that are hard. And so I'm very intentional on Sunday mornings that what precedes worship for us is not things that are skill building. I don't want to have to struggle with problem behavior before we sit down to really work on the things that matter the most. So for us, that might be that I don't ask for them to do chores. I don't ask for things that I know are going to be a battle or that I'm going to have to stand and really help and skill build with. One child does not like to write. I would not give him something to write or color immediately before worship. It all depends on what your children are good at and what is challenging for them. Some might find puzzles great. Some might find puzzles terrible. You don't want the terribly onerous activities to precede worship, because you're using your emotional bandwidth in things that really don't matter before getting to the place where we're trying to build the things that do matter for that hour. We want them to have as much emotional and social bandwidth as possible. So maybe some of your kids may even need to take a break and be away from other siblings before coming together for worship. Number two, before worship is not the time to allow them to engage in the most highly desired activity. And you might say, why? Maybe that would help. And I say, no, because you're going to have to pull them away from that activity to go to something that's hard. So rule of thumb in behavior is never have something that is super fun that precedes something that is super challenging, because then you're going to battle the transition and you're going to start that challenging activity on a harder foot. So you want to try to find neutral activities. You want to use those activities that they love to follow worship, which is going to be the next slide. So what follows worship also matters. I think one important note here to remember that children with disabilities and teens as well pair activities and emotions together really quickly. So if they have worked really hard during church and then church ends and they have to go immediately into something that's hard again, they may begin to pair church with just bad, because that hour isn't an hour of doing this and then an hour of doing this. It's this whole big lump that you're requiring me to do hard things. So after worship, the schedule shouldn't move into another activity with high demands. Ideally, you allow a break. And even more ideally than that, I would love to see you pairing the end of worship with something that your kids love to do. And especially for hard work. When they've worked hard, I like to really reward that work with access to something for a short period of time in order to say, good job doing that work. For us, it might be one child loves to create train stories right now outside. And so this past Sunday after worship, for working hard the whole time, he got to go out and I told the story while the little wooden engines ran around and fell off into the muddy pit below, the little ravine on the side. So we just get creative and we build on things they love. It might be that your kids love access to screen time and you allow 5 minutes, 10 minutes of that. A special snack, one of ours loves to wrestle with dad. And so that is something he often will work for. It doesn't have to cost. It just has to be an investment in them. You worked, and I want to show you that what you worked really matters. And I love how hard you're trying, because I know it is hard. Okay, so here is how we break these goals down. Instead of just saying, I want my kids to be good during worship, let's teach some skills. So this first goal is still actually a little bit bigger than I would like for you to be thinking about, but I'm going to show it as an initial, and then we'll break it down some more. So let's say you want to focus on attention to task. Here's kind of the steps of doing that. Number one, you want to determine the maximum amount of time that your kids can attend to a task. I gauge this on how long can my child do something that's easy that they love, and how long can they do something that is challenging that they don't necessarily love. Attention to those tasks will give you baselines. So you will then know, obviously we're not gonna be able to reach the one, like if they love screen time and they could do that forever. Obviously that is not gonna be the baseline we use for deciding how much time they can attend to worship on a computer. Instead, I would look at the baseline for challenging things. So maybe my kid can sit for 5 minutes and can have quiet mouth, quiet body. And notice I'm not saying silent mouth and perfect body. I'm going for middle of the road here. Quiet hands, quiet feet, quiet mouth is how we describe it, which would involve not hitting, pushing, kicking, or yelling. We do allow whispering and questions, and as long as it's not disrupting, because we're not going for perfect. So I would say if my child can do that for 5 minutes and I'm starting this and I've had trouble in worship, I'm going to back that up and I'm going to start at 2 or 3 minutes that I'm requiring my child to sit, because we're training this process. Again, small steps over time. So you're going to need to decide what the reward would be for sitting for 2 to 3 minutes quietly and watching, or just, in the beginning, we didn't start with even watching the screen. It was just quiet mouth, quiet hands, quiet feet. And so it needs to be something that's easily consumable. That would be, maybe it's access to a tablet to draw on, or maybe it is the stickers, maybe it is something in your child's love set that you can easily hand over and then take back. When I started this process with my boys, my oldest, I did 3 minutes, and he would then get access to our boogie board, which is just a little screen, but it's not electronic, that you can draw on and then it erases. And we would decide before Sunday what the pictures were going to be. So when he would sit for his 2 or 3 minutes, and then I would draw a picture of whatever he had requested, hand it to him, and then he would doodle around it, and then he would give it back to me, and we'd earn again. And we did that through the whole service for a year and a half before I had fully faded to what was more or less 8 to 10 minutes where he could attend and then have a fun drawing or whatever it was that day that he wanted to work for. Now that might sound really big. Example where I would start is pick one thing. Let's just target quiet mouth this week. If that helps, having your kid in the same room, and we just need them to not make as much noise so that everybody can participate. Let's not even worry about where they're sitting. They're just in the room and they're quiet mouth. This might be how you go about that. We've got to decide what quiet mouth really means. Does that mean no yelling, no screaming, no talking? Is whispering okay? After you decide that, decide how long your kid can go with a quiet mouth, and then reduce that time by 2 or 3 minutes in the beginning. Decide what they're working for. I use the timer on my phone. I don't make it bing. I just let the time keep going. And then I've gotten really good at this. I've had 7 years practice on one of passing things over when the timer is hitting our appropriate amount of time of sitting. Depending on the age of your kid, you're probably going to need to offer breaks along the way when you're targeting something so specific as this. If they are talkative, and never quiet in real life, and this is a real challenge in the context of worship, then you might do 2 or 3 rounds of this and then give them a 5 or 10 minute break where they're able to go to another room and use their words and then call them back. That's the beauty of Livestream. You can take a break and bring them back. And in this context, you don't even have to go with them like you would at church and hope that you can find a place where you can hear it packed in. You can likely stay and they can go play, and then you can call them back. Gradually increase the time as skill mastery is demonstrated. So my rule of thumb is if I see problem behavior appearing, I never increase the time. If problem behavior doesn't appear on Sunday, then I increase the time by 1 or 2 minutes the next week. And so over the weeks, I'm building up by 2 to 3 minutes at a time, maybe even 5 for older kids. And we're making progress towards 15-minute chunks and 30-minute chunks that they can sit and have a quiet mouth. Maybe you want to focus on transition skills. My tips here would be create visuals that show the appropriate action to do during each part of the service. I think it's hard for kids to know, am I supposed to sing or am I supposed to speak? Am I supposed to be loud? Am I supposed to not? Is it okay to, in the church service, shake hands now and stand up and talk to people, but I can't the rest of the time? Or now I'm supposed to stand and now I'm supposed to sit. So for us, lots of visuals have helped, and I have a clipboard that I just keep and everything's tucked under there, and I whip out the right one at the right time for what I want each kid to be doing. So start with 2 appropriate actions. Don't think about the whole church service. Just say, okay, today I want to work on praying and singing, or for the next couple weeks, or I want to work on standing versus sitting. Decide what 2 actions you want to work on and start there and train for those, which means that we're not as worried about what is happening in the other parts. You're targeting skill growth in one area at a time. I think what becomes likely, what you're saying in your mind is, oh no, like if I target this, then all these other things are not going to get done and they're going to fall apart in other ways. And you're right. But don't forget that none of us can learn 15 things at once. And you're in a unique category with kids with disabilities. They don't just learn on the fly. And they can't do 10 things all at one time. So targeting one skill at a time and building that skill in then allows you to move on to the next skill. And yes, it might be messy in the beginning, and it might be messy for a while. But if you stick with it, you will make progress, and you will have kids that come out on the other side that can do more in worship. You'll hear me say often, I want our kids present in worship, but I don't just want them to be counting down the time till it's over. I really want them active and engaged in worship. And so being committed to building those skills is the way you get there. And then once again, you want to offer that positive reinforcement for your kids when they meet those goals of being able to sit and stand and or sing or speak or whatever it is that you're trying to get out in the transition. Similar for expressive language goals, I would pick one part of the service that repeats that you want your kid to start saying with everyone else or singing with everyone else. Maybe it's the doxology that repeats every week. You're going to have to work on the words throughout the week in order for them to reappear on Sunday. Things don't appear on Sunday that they don't know Monday through Saturday. It just never works out that way. So being intentional during the week of what you want to learn. And I always pick the most repeatable parts because I want the most practice possible on Sunday mornings. So think about, what does your pastor do regularly? Or what do you know is coming up that if you put the work into it for several weeks, it will occur in the sermon. Don't pick a hymn that you just love but have no idea when it will repeat. And then as you're teaching throughout the week, I would try to attach that positive reinforcement there. It could be tickles, that they do a great job and they get a tickle. Or little ones, I used to throw my little ones up in the air during the week when we would do certain parts of memory verse, and they would get thrown up in the air. And then once we had faded to learning the whole memory verse, we faded to things that were more appropriate for church. So they would get a sticker, a piece of candy, or something consumable that went quicker on a Sunday morning. But I had to do my work during the week to get those skills to appear. Receptive language skills, pick one piece that you want your kids to understand. And once again, you're going to work on it during the week. What I say for targeting receptive language is use pre-recorded services to teach for understanding. It's so hard when words are going so fast on Sunday mornings to try to pause and say, this is what the pastor was talking about. If you find, for example, whether maybe it's Lord's Supper or maybe it is when you're back together at baptism, certain parts that you really want your kids to understand, use those recorded services so that you can stop it periodically, rewind and see it again. Oh, did you see how the pastor did that? Building in language that they understand to go alongside of maybe the larger church and theological language that they don't understand. Okay, and then tips for navigating the sermon. So here's some big questions that you need to ask. Number one, decide ahead of time whether you are going to continue with the children's church model if your kids are little. If they've been leaving at the sermon, you have options. Option 1 is this can be the time in life where we learn to sit and do the sermon. Option 2 is that they can go ahead and go on and be dismissed with younger siblings, and they can do their things so that you can focus on the service. I do think it's a great time without pressure for our kids with disabilities to learn these skills. I think being intentional in the time that God is giving us at home never hurts. So if you decide to work on this, would be my approach. I often at church, if we were at church, I would say, let your child go to children's church and then bring them back in at the end, the last 5 minutes. And then we would do the last 7 minutes and then the last 10 minutes. And we would fade backwards until we were in there the whole time, so that they still got to do that fun transition to children's church. In this context, you're likely dismissing them to not anything else to do other than play with siblings, and it may or may not be as fun as what children's church is. So I think here you have the option of working from the front, keeping your kids for 5 extra minutes and then dismissing them. And then the next week we're going to build on that. And depending on your kid and the disability type, maybe you add a minute, maybe you add 3 minutes, maybe you add 5 minutes. I wouldn't add more than 5 minutes per week with kids with disabilities, because 5-minute chunks feel like a lot when you're little. And what we want to do is kind of sneak them into staying for longer. We don't want to just shock their systems and go from 30 minutes to now we're here an hour. Instead, 33 minutes or 31 minutes to then 33 minutes, then 35 minutes, then 37 minutes. You have weeks ahead where you can build this in and get to whatever your goal is, if not the whole sermon, at least getting through a chunk of it. And those skills will transfer, even if we end up back in church before you make it all the way to the whole end of the sermon. Your work will not be in vain. We can give you tips for how to make what we call generalizing skills from home to church. Do not increase your time if problem behavior presents, and then reward hard work with immediate access to an item or activity that your child desires. This is really a lot easier in the sermon if you're keeping them an extra 5 minutes and then 10, because you can dismiss them to something that they love to do, or you can set up something in the other room that they can go to and earn that they're not earning during the week. Number 5 is important. Children with disabilities do not have a reservoir of ideas for when they're bored. You guys probably already see that in all other areas of life. I have one who will come to me, and he has the better expressive language, and he knows that he's not good at this skill of being bored and waiting. And so the way he phrases it to me is always, what can I do while I wait? Because he can't come up with, look at the windows or count the curtains or whatever it is that kids typically do to buy time when they're bored. So my encouragement here is to plan and prepare some special items that your child has access to only during the sermon. I really do find that this works better if they don't see them at all except during the sermon. Each of our kids has a computer bag in a color that they chose, like a laptop bag. That's their Bible sermon bag. And in it, they got to pick what they wanted to write with or color with. So they all picked, of course, the special markers that mom doesn't allow the rest of the time. And we have things in there that are developmentally appropriate for each one. We have pre-readers and we have non-writers. And so not all of them want to color, not all of them can read. And so over time, there's one that loves working with putty. There's one that loves having his boogie board, and so his is reserved just for the sermon. And one loves to draw, and so he does have his book that he can draw. And they all have their sermon bulletins stuck in there. And then we have special reinforcers for the sermon. All of mine have grown up knowing that if they start to stay for the service, they get a special piece of candy. Our kids all have eating issues, and so we haven't been able to do chewy candy. So they've always had a dum-dum. The special treat for getting to stay is that when our pastor starts to read the word, you get a piece of candy, and mom always whispers, and God's word is even sweeter than this sucker. Listen to what the pastor's telling you. Here's your candy. And so they look forward. They are on it for when the sermon starts, because they get their candy that we don't give them any other time in the world other than Sunday mornings. Dum-dums are not special unless your mom goes through on Halloween and pulls them all out, and you never get them except on Sunday morning. So I'm very particular about making sure the special Sunday things only happen on Sunday. Thinking again back to parents, the only behaviors that we can really change are our own. That's the only ones that we have complete control over. We can influence all we want, and we can set a plan. But at the end of the day, it really is up to us to be the ones that set the tone and the mood for what we're asking our kids to do. So you'll see grumpy, frustrated, and rushed versus joyful, patient, and prepared. My biggest conviction with the live stream has been that I don't prepare for it the way that I did for church. Because I don't have anywhere to go, because I have to turn on a computer or the TV, I'm not as apt to set myself up for success. And so I feel a lot more rushed, and then it turns into grumpy and frustrated a lot quicker than when I was actually at church. Number 2, training children, again, is work. It's not easy. I think reminding ourselves that it will feel like work by the time you finish the sermon. And I'm going to talk about how to care for our own souls in just a minute as well. And then one of my seminary professors a long time ago, it said, your preparation for Sunday morning ideally begins on Monday, the next day after. I'm not that good in my ability to parent these 3 little people. I often am not starting on Monday. But my change to this would be, if we're not preparing by Saturday night, it's probably going to mean a rushed Sunday morning. And so even just tweaks there to what we do ahead of time, reminding ourselves to set out the clothes like we did when we were really going to church. It doesn't have to be church clothes, but just setting them out so the routine is carried. The little tips that make Sunday mornings go more peacefully. Here's some tips for planning ahead. Number 1, I would encourage your families to use the largest screen possible. We tried a few different options on this over these last couple of weeks. And I do really think for our disability types, the larger the screen, the more active participation we're able to get. So getting our live stream onto the TV was a game changer. After weeks 1 and 2, we went from one computer to a larger computer, and then finally wrangled our computer, or our TV, which wasn't set up to host live stream things, to make it work, and it was a game changer. So if you haven't tried that, try the largest screen possible. Give yourself plenty of time for setup on Sunday mornings. Nothing's worse than rushing because technology won't work. Number 3, ask yourself weekly, what do I want my children to remember about this unique time of home worship? That's more for the parent heart. What do you want them to remember about this? And what do you think they're going to remember based on the way our Sundays unfold? Number 4, find a quiet place before worship begins, and just 1 minute, or 30 seconds or longer, in prayer can really help set your own heart right for being patient, for training in worship, and for dealing with problem behavior that you know will likely pop out. Number 5, try to limit the negative expressions and the commentary on worship to after the service. A lot of times parents say things, commentary on life about their kids or about the service, and kids pick up on that, whether or not they're able to express the same things, or it just sets the tone and the mood. Debriefing afterwards, I just would encourage you to try that nugget of truth and see if it transforms some of the attitude around worship. If they sense that you're not happy with something and they may not understand why, it may influence their behavior. And then last, have conversations about Sunday throughout the week. This has really been key for our boys they don't grasp a lot about why the virus has us all home anyway. But to keep things positive, we talk about things we saw on Sunday on the computer. Hey, do you remember when the pastor did this? Or did you notice that we could see the arm of somebody, poking out of the choir? our camera doesn't pan to the choir, and that really bothers our literal-minded children, that they can't see the 2 or 3 people over there. And sometimes you'll get an elbow or an arm, and they just think that that is wonderful, and that tells me they're watching and engaged. And so I try to find things for them to look for and search for on the TV to keep them tracking with what they see in front of them. And then again, inviting our kids into the things that we love. If we love worship, we'll talk about it as much or more than the other things in life that we talk about and love. So here's caring for your own soul. I often walk away from Sundays with a pre-marriage and kids mentality. I have to work really hard to remind myself training is a very different season in life than when I used to be able to walk in and sit down and just worship as much as my heart wanted to with no distractions. This is true for parents with any kids. It's hard work. So a game changer for me has been to really make sure that I'm feeding my own soul at a different point in the week if I'm having to work really hard during worship to teach my kids and to keep them involved. Right now, I'm just loving the fact that I have access to all the preachers that I have loved across the years in Livestream. They're all, recorded, and you can watch them during the week. And so I have really changed my routine during the virus to go and watch the little church that I really grew up in, and that just the pastor feels more like part of the family. I go back to that church and join them in worship at some point during the week when the kids are not with me, and I feed my own soul. I have more to give if I have poured in first. I'm also really careful to try to develop a doable plan for my own Bible reading and praying. I think parents of kids with disabilities need to give themselves a lot of grace and space here, that what you likely did before kids is not what is doable with them. So small steps. Maybe it's writing out one scripture each day. Maybe it's praying. Maybe it's being still and just knowing that He is God this week. Maybe it's reminding yourself that as we draw near to God, He will draw near to you. Take advantage of other opportunities to pour into your own soul, podcasts, sermons on the go while you're walking. Fill yourself up so that you can make connections even when you're distracted on Sunday mornings.